Hello, I'm Bob the Booker and welcome to my channel. And today, carrying on with the Booker long list, I wanted to talk about Wild Houses by Colin Barrett. This is a book I'd been kind of planning on reading for a while, and actually, luckily, the Booker long listing kind of bumped it up a little bit. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some parts that might go into spoiler territory. So I'll announce before I do that, before I kind of go into spoilers. But there should be hopefully a good amount where I'm talking about the book as a whole, without necessarily going into that. So if you've not read it yet, feel free to jump off at the point that you need to. But let's get talking about this book. So this book, the core idea behind it really is looking at sort of various dysfunctional families, is a probably diplomatic way of putting it. So the sort of main families that we hear from in this involve a lot of tension. There's a large part of this book is about sort of various families, particularly two families where there's a set of disagreements, shall we say. One of those is particularly the family that we focus in on. We meet them and sort of spend quite a lot of time with them, particularly Dev is one character who we see through his school days. And we spend quite a lot of time with this family, mostly to sort of understand the kinds of odd world that they live in the sense that so much of their lives is, so much of their lives is dependent on having money, getting enough money, sort of surviving through to the next bit where they might need some money. And so this sort of small town working class kind of identity is kind of kept up a lot in this book. It's sort of a big part of the book is really examining that and examining the sort of various ways that they often make decisions that seem maybe illogical or maybe not like the best decisions, again, to put it diplomatically, and as a result end up in sort of these horrible circumstances sometimes. And I thought particularly the early parts of this book, talking about some of the school life for young Dev, I thought were really interestingly done, as well kind of added into that the kind of lyricism of this. And I can't believe in some ways this is the only Irish book on the long list. And I think I often love about a lot of Irish writers is just the kind of the playfulness of language and dialogue and so many other things. And this kind of comes up particularly strongly when we look at Dev. And at one point, we get these really beautiful, haunting passages, I think, of Dev talking about being this loner at school, and the kind of various ways that he tries to make sense of what's going on around him. You know, he grows up to be quite a tall boy and kind of quite muscular, or quite kind of stocky or broad-shouldered in some ways, at least compared to his peers. And so for many of the people around him, he should be the kind of person you don't touch. You know, he's the more physically threatening person, but he's quite mild-mannered and quite calm. And so we watch as he is essentially quite passive in the face of bullying against him, where, you know, the big sort of tough boys in the school try and overwhelm him. And I thought the passages, particularly around those, were so beautifully done, at kind of looking at the ways that he becomes more and more isolated. That, you know, there are these really beautiful little throwaway lines about, you know, not keeping friends around because, you know, he puts in almost this minimal effort, or it suddenly gets to the point where friendships are things that have to be worked on, and so these things don't happen for him as much because he's sort of become more and more passive and withdrawn. There are also these great lines in the book, and let me get this one here. Hang on, let me find it again. Basically, he describes someone's face as looking like a vandalized church, which I just think is poetry. I think that's so cleverly observed, as sort of, it's quite a startling and odd image, but the more you spend time with it, the more you kind of get what's going on here. And I think, yeah, this story of Dev then gets kind of rolled into bigger conversations around many more things, and things get a lot more violent and a lot more terrifying for everybody involved. it's going to be difficult to talk about some of these bits without going into spoilers, so I'll do that in a moment. But first, just to say, I think this book builds to quite an interesting point of tension, which is also kind of teased right from the beginning. It's sort of, the time jumps around a little bit. The book also, I should say, starts with a really in-depth description of a dog, which I was very happy about. There's a family dog that is this sort of slightly happy-go-lucky little thing, and the way the book does it really appealed to me, of just this acknowledgement of this dog as part of the family unit, and the way the dog is a really big part of that early bit of the story. So anyway, that is another thing I'll say. But I think this book does really well in kind of sitting in that discomfort and that dysfunction of the families. It finds the sort of humour in it, but it also fully acknowledges that this is a dire way for these characters to be living. You've got, you know, these young characters. Dev particularly is this young boy who becomes more and more isolated, and a big part of that is around his family and who is still around and who is there to look after him. And he falls down various rabbit holes to try and stay in his own, sort of happy in his own way. But we see the effect it has on the rest of the family as well. And that's going to be more difficult to talk about without going into spoilers. So I'll put a little spoiler curtain here, and then I'll go and talk about it in just a sec. If you do need to drop off here, absolutely fine. But I think this is a really interesting book, and a really kind of fun, sort of wisecracking kind of book. Although, and I see why it's on the list. I also am kind of surprised that this is the only Irish one, because I think there are many other wonderful Irish books released this year that could go toe to toe with this, or be sort of an even stronger part of the list. But anyway, let's go on to some of the spoilers. So with the spoiler curtain in effect, or kind of having dropped, or whatever it is, a character doll is a big part of this, and this is a young man who's been nicknamed Doll. And a big part of the plot, particularly towards the end of the book, is around him being kidnapped. And the reason for him being kidnapped is in lieu of a payment. It's an acknowledgement that about 30 grand is missing. And that 30 grand that's owed, or I think it's around 30 grand, it's a lot of money regardless, that is owed, is, you know, already a big amount of money. It's also owed to a family who, let's say, are kind of fairly eager to get that money back and will not kind of take a polite IOU to get that money back. And so kidnapping Dev is a really big, Doll is a really big part of that. And the family unit immediately breaks into the sort of, well, we've got to do everything we can to get Doll back. But it turns into this wider thing, because that money was, some of the money that they did have came from drugs and selling drugs and various other things. Some of the other, and the way that this money ended up being lost was because they were also safeguarding money and drugs for this family. And so the whole thing starts to, we almost see the sort of the things drop bit by bit. We watch as the dominoes start to fall, and knowing that this family is going to be in really dire straits as a result. This is not something that they can easily make happen. And indeed, the kind of the action of a character who's otherwise relatively quiet in the book, Nikki, is a big reason for how this ends up getting resolved. And it's one of those, I think the way that builds up Nikki, and particularly the way the book ends, I think is a really beautiful kind of coda to everything that's happened. It's this really, I think, beautiful and quiet end to what's otherwise been quite a noisy, plot-driven book. And I think the way that the book kind of reframes that around this idea of who really is family, who really is kind of your community, I think is a really beautiful ending. And I kind of see how the book kind of gets that there, and allows you to kind of end on this beautiful note. Yeah, the one thing I will say on this as well is I was sort of talking with some other sort of bookstagrammers and booktubers on like a little group chat about the booker list more generally, and somebody made the point, which I think is a really good one, that sometimes when you know a book has been listed, particularly for the booker, it can somewhat change the way you approach the book. So I feel like actually, had I listened to or read Wild Houses months ago before the announcement, I think I would have been like, great, that's really interesting. Whereas I think I approach this book with slightly more, to some degree, focus, or some degree more analysis of what is it? Is it going to do anything unexpected? Is it going to be different in some ways? And in some ways, that's quite a hard thing to put on a book. It's not the book's fault that it's, you know, not kind of innovating in a massive way or whatever. You know, it's fine to tell a good story well. I think the thing I found quite odd with this book is, in some ways, looking at it, I kind of was like, well, great, this is a fairly standard story, in some ways told in a more you know, in a more traditional way, with really funny bits of dialogue, very lyrical, very clever, a really propulsive plot, interesting characters, a dog, and all of those sorts of things, and that is great. But part of me wonders if I was also maybe looking for more, and some parts of the book, in some ways, I almost wondered if I wanted it to just push a little bit further or to do slightly more. I don't know quite what that would have been, but interesting regardless. And I still think an interesting book on this list. I would not be surprised in some ways if it made it to the shortlist. I think it's engaging enough. I think the plot itself will work on a reread, because to some degree it's not a big twist or anything, but to some degree the layering of the story throughout the book might mean that flipping it round and reading it again, knowing the kind of end of the book, might change in some ways some of the ways we interpret parts of it. So I'm intrigued either way. But yes, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Please don't leave any spoilers in the comments if you can. And I hope you enjoyed the book. Take care and speak to you soon. Bye bye.